Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Wilson. I'm the Director of Technical Services and Education for Carolina's Ready Mix Concrete Association. And this is a part of our Webinar Wednesday series. It happens monthly, and this particular topic is carbon reduction strategies. I do want to welcome our guest speaker, James, today. He's the Director of Sustainability for WAP Sustainability Consulting, and they are an affinity partner of CRMCA. And so with that being said, we work with them regularly along with our member producers to provide sustainability services. So James, welcome. Thank you for your time and expertise. We appreciate you. Also, I just want to mention too that, of course, we always abide by the antitrust policy here at CRMCA. Do never share any kind of, again, private business information and or pricing. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and start our program. So to begin to kind of establish the framework as to why we're talking about LCAs and or environmental product declarations today, I do want to establish the foundational premise as to why. So from an owner perspective, specifically for ready mix producers, there are a number of environmental priorities. And there, again, many different ways that we can address sustainability from an owner perspective, but the top 5 concerns when we're looking to reduce our carbon emissions as an industry are carbon reduction through mix optimization primarily. So again, looking at our mix designs and how can we be more efficient with our cement usage, as well as new SCMs or sustainable supplementary materials that can be included into our mixes to further drive carbon emissions associated with, again, the cubic yards that we pour. Finally, we want to look at our operation of facility emissions, so the actual facility in which we're operating, whether that be an office and or a batch plant. There are many ways that we can further apply green building strategies to curb carbon emissions, which are calculated, again, from a life cycle assessment standpoint. This is something that is usually on the bottom of a priority list, but again, something that should be considered from an owner and operating perspective. Also, waste management. Are we wasting time? And moreover, are we wasting products? When we talk about waste concrete, this is a very serious issue for owners in the ready mix field. How can we be more efficient with our fleet, our, of course, employees, as well as our actual tangible materials and products? I mentioned fleet just a moment ago. When we look at logistics and, of course, the fuel that is consumed when we're talking about transporting our materials to sites and also transporting our materials to our actual ready mix facilities, these are all components that factor into our carbon emissions from an owner standpoint. So again, how can we be more efficient with our fleet? Obviously, there are a number of technologies that producers use in order to track and manage this and also be more efficient from that perspective. However, there are more technologies coming down the pipeline that will further allow us to be more efficient through the use of artificial intelligence to look at how we can really, I would say, be predictive and how our customers are going to act, and moreover, how we can, again, utilize our fleet in more sustainable and efficient measures. Logistics is a huge piece of the ready mix industry, not a new revelation for those of you on the line, but again, a core environmental priority that we must consider when curbing carbon. And then finally, sustainable sites. We can talk about this from our offices across the board in terms of corporate headquarters if you're a larger company, but then we can also consider this from a batching plant perspective as well. We talk about air quality and, of course, water quality, and how we can, again, incorporate more holistic, sustainable site measures to improve both air and water quality in the communities in which we operate. So these are all going to be topics that we will delve deeper into as our Webinar Wednesday series progresses. But moreover, today we're going to look specifically at what owners can do from a life cycle assessment standpoint to look at leverage points that will not only improve your business bottom line, but also will, again, impact that global warming potential factor that a lot of our end users are considering when procuring sustainable concrete. So with that being said, I do want to go ahead and hand over the presentation to James today. Again, thank you for joining us, who's going to take a deeper dive into the LCA process and also what categories are being considered from a global warming perspective.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And yeah, thanks for everyone that joined us. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. If not, feel free to chime in. So yeah, definitely really exciting to be here, especially talking around the topics of actually reducing carbon. You know, I think we find in these sustainability initiatives, a lot of times, especially when things are kind of early, as I think things are right now, in the grand scheme of things, that it's probably more about transparency and getting information out there. But I think that, I mean, naturally shifts very quickly into lowering carbon, and you're already starting to see that with carbon thresholds and various buy clean legislation, basically targets that people have to hit, that you're going to have to hit. So the idea of you know, looking at an LCA, or utilizing an LCA and some of the tools that we use to create EPDs, really they can provide a lot of insight on where environmental impacts are happening in your supply chains and in your product, and to be able to really quickly consider the trade-offs of different options you might have. Let's say a higher carbon, let's say, ingredient, but sourced from further away, or the trade-offs of different SCMs, and you know, needing to do that on a product basis, not on a component basis, because as we all know, things perform differently, you know, when put into real world concrete things. So with that, got a few topics. I'd like to kind of introduce ourselves and WAP for those of you that don't know us. I think we've done some other webinars for CRMCA, but happy to do that anyway. And then before we kind of get into the meat of this, I'd like to discuss some of the key LCA concepts, terminology, things like that, so we're not leaving anyone behind. And then briefly about, I think you guys are probably seeing this, some of the pressure on EPDs right now coming out of the public and private sector procurement. But really, I'd like to focus on the implementation and kind of what information we're needing to do LCAs and EPDs, and how you can then utilize that, and especially through our software platforms that we've developed, to really quickly do those types of trade-off analysis, and you know, consider carbon reduction strategies in a real-world context. And then finally, just a link so you guys can connect with us after this, so in case you aren't already. So about WAP, this is quite outdated. This is probably about twice as big as this now, but just to put this up there to show you that we are all over North America, headquartered out of Tennessee. Myself, I'm located up in that far left, top left corner in British Columbia, but actually grew up and lived most of my life in the Southeast. So excited to be talking to you about this, and excited that sustainability and these carbon sort of initiatives are now very much nationwide, and we definitely have the team to support that. So some of the LCA concepts, some of the terminology really quickly. Most of these I'm sure you've sort of heard of, or probably heard of. So we have environmental product declarations. Now, the relationship between an environmental product declaration and LCA is that environmental product declarations are really a public-facing summary of an LCA. So it's kind of whereas the life cycle assessment is the science and the analysis of actually looking at the life cycle of a product. An environmental product declaration, what it does is it takes all of that information and it summarizes it, and it does so in a consistent way, so that an end user can pick up an environmental product declaration of one product or another, and they're going to you know, have some confidence they're looking at things apples to apples, and that there's some consistency between those. And the way that works is there are what's called product category rules that underlie all of the EPDs. So we have product category rules specific to different product groups. So think ready mix concrete, concrete masonry units, they have their own PCR, precast concrete, and also looking upstream at things like cement and SCMs, working right now on an admixture PCR. So basically, you know, the PCR or the rules and the framework to conduct the LCA, and then the EPD is really the public-facing part of that that summarizes all of that modeling and research and results so that it's digestible and usable. And we talk about the life cycle of a product. You know, it's typically, you know, you see this graphic where things are circular. There's definitely some of that, but really, you know, the idea is that in LCA or life cycle assessment, we're not looking at one single part of the operation. We're not looking at, let's say, just your plant or just your materials or just the transportation. It's a way to pull all of that information into a common framework so that trade-offs and environmental impacts that occur at different parts of the life cycle can be considered in a common framework. So again, think the trade-off, for instance, of a material that may have caused less carbon emissions in its production, but possibly it's located further away from a plant, or there's something about it that requires other materials. So by putting it into the life cycle approach, you are basically taking steps to make sure that there's not unforeseen consequences in other parts of the life cycle you may not be considering. But in LCA and EPDs, you know, things, you know, and the way these things have evolved is that it's really been grouped, the life cycle has been grouped into certain buckets for the different portions of the life cycle, and this has become very standardized. So we have this first part of the life cycle, raw material production and product manufacturing, and also in between there, the transportation of the materials to the production facility. We call that cradle to gate. And what you'll find is that 95% of the EPDs that are out there are cradle to gate, which makes sense because that's the part of the life cycle that the manufacturer has control over. So essentially looking at everything from the extraction of raw materials, the pre-processing, what happens at the cement plants, the admixture facilities, et cetera, and then transporting those materials to your plant, and then the actual makeup of the product and the product composition and the activities that happen at your plant. So when we get into the data collection here in just a minute, the data requirements, this is really the focus of what we're going to be doing. But it's not to say that there aren't such things as cradle to grave LCA, and quite frankly, I think you're going to start to see a lot more of cradle to grave LCA, because keeping in this spirit of unforeseen consequences and wanting the analysis to be holistic and look at the whole life cycle, there's now, I think, a kind of growing concern that only providing the information about the product may fall short of that. So for today's purposes, I wouldn't worry too much about this. This is going to evolve over the next couple of years. But I can say that there are leadership within the industry, I'm thinking CRMCA at a national level, that essentially are the ones that manage the development of the product category rules. My understanding is the plan in the very near future, probably starting next year, is to start to work on these cradle to grave rules and what it would take to incorporate, let's say, the construction of a building, transportation, the construction site, things that happen during the building's use, one of which is carbonation, which you may or may not be aware of, familiar with, where essentially the concrete's removing CO2 out of the atmosphere due to exposure. So I think, you know, as we, and then again at the end of life, the potential recovery of materials, and use of those materials in future products. All of those things are obviously critical for the understanding the environmental impacts of a product, but they are tricky, as you can imagine, kind of establishing what those baselines would be for things that are kind of downstream production. And then finally, especially when we're starting to get into circular economy concepts and the idea of recovering a material and then using it as a substitute for other materials. So think crushed concrete as a substitute for aggregate, for example. Then you get into what are called external benefits. And if you're in an EPD, these sometimes show up in what's called Module D. But these are really benefits that are caused by the product life cycle that occur outside of it. So if I'm producing concrete and it's recycled at the end of life, I know that it has some, it's going to cause some, displacement in another life cycle where they're not having to produce, let's say, virgin aggregate. So like I said, though, for our purposes right now, LCAs and EPDs are really cradle to gate focused. We're not making any assumptions downstream on what happens, for better or for worse. I think very likely in the very near future, you'll probably see the modules where we're talking about delivery to the job site start to be included, because that's kind of a natural consideration that one would be if they're considering different concrete vendors in a metro area or something like that, for instance. They don't include carbonation during use, current concrete EPDs, whereas we are looking at the calcination, the actual emission of the CO2 at the cement plant. We're not actually taking any in consideration currently in our EPDs for the uptake of that CO2, but I think that will change soon. And then the units of these are physical units, so a meter cube of concrete is what we use. In aggregate, it's a ton. Cement, same, it's a ton. But concrete, since it's a volume business, we base everything based on a meter cube basis. Now, in our software, you'll see that you can put in all of your information in Imperial. We're not forcing anybody to look up conversion factors or anything like that. We can handle things in native units, but everything is normalized to a cubic meter. But like I said, I think things will move very quickly, or maybe not quickly, but eventually move towards more of a cradle to grave, where we're looking at the use phase, what happens at end of life. We're looking at the actual orientation and surfaces of concrete products and building materials to actually calculate this carbonation effect, which is possible, but it's a sophisticated calculation where you need to know a lot about the building, including its exposure levels, things like that. But at the end of the day, especially when I think there is the ability to compare to some degree concrete products to concrete products, but especially when we're starting to get in, moving past that even and looking at different building materials compared to each other, that it needs to be, some consideration of what happens after the production. I think that's generally understood. And when we're doing life cycle assessment, what we're doing is we're gathering what we call activity data. So we're gathering information from you on how much energy you're using, the distances, these kind of raw data. And what we're doing is we're then linking it in our software to databases. So that could be something like an EPD from your cement supplier or from your admixture supplier, but also potentially an industry average life cycle assessment. That's another piece of data that we use to complete these models. And the purpose of what we're doing there is we're starting with your data, we call it the foreground, and then we're actually tracing all of those inputs back to their origin in nature, so we're not missing anything. And we're actually then tracking all the emissions that occur from those processes and from those energy sources and things like that, again, to their eventual, where they end up in nature. So that's the idea of LCA, is you kind of start with a process or a flow, and then you track it until you get back to where its actual boundary is with nature. So think, let's say, take this example where we're looking at greenhouse gases. We may have the use of a natural gas or heat fuel or something like that, or electricity. And that's the information we're gathering from you. And then in our systems, what we're doing is we link that to our databases that tell us that, let's say, the flow of 10 cubic meters, or 50, I don't know, making a number up, 10, 20 cubic meters of natural gas emits 100 kilograms of CO2. It emits 1 kilogram, let's say, of methane, smaller amount of dinitrogen monoxide. But what we have to do at that point is we take that inventory information and we actually scale that to get the environmental impacts. So we know that different emissions have different potencies, if you will, in terms of their global warming, and we have factors associated with that. So in this case, CO2 gets a 1, whereas methane and dinitrogen monoxide get a much higher factor. We essentially scale all of the different flows till we get the environmental impact information that we're looking at. So this is where, you know, when you're seeing on an EPD, the carbon footprint or the GWP, this is how we're calculating. But again, the key thing here is this, everything to the right of the arrow is something that we're handling. You know, what you're really asked to do is this activity data, the raw information from your systems. And obviously, global warming potentials, the kind of hot ticket item these days, gets all the attention. But we are calculating a range of different environmental impacts, which I think will become more and more useful over time. It's about 25 different indicators, we call them, that we calculate. These are probably the big 6. You see these in LEED specifications and some of the LEED kind of inspired specifications for EPDs and materials, where we're looking at not just global warming, but acidification, eutrophication, some of these essentially accumulations of chemicals in the environment. Ozone depletion, which is a little bit of a legacy issue. Ozone depletion not being as significant as it was probably 30, 40 years ago, by and large been curbed by different, say, CFC bans and things like that that happened in the 80s. And then you have local impacts like smog, and then also the use of resources, so like fossil fuel, water, things like that. So Jessica touched a little bit on some of the kind of market drivers, but I want to touch on this really quick because it's really rapidly evolving. What we've seen in the last couple of years from the federal government is pretty unprecedented, where they've basically adopted EPDs as the mechanism for them to pursue their low carbon objectives. This is a map of low carbon projects funded by the GSA across the US. You can see there's many of them. They're not in one particular region. There's several in your region. And what these are doing is they're now requiring EPDs for all of the different kind of core structural materials, so concrete being one of them. So we think this is definitely a sign of the kind of trends and what's coming. So if you haven't, let's say, seen EPDs on a specification, it's likely that you will. And you know, what we found is it goes from not really seeing it very much on the specs to seeing it on lots and lots of specs, can happen very rapidly in different markets once that happens. The good news is the federal government has stepped up to the plate with some funding for some of this. Starting to see some of the announcements happening right now, where there will be grant assistance essentially to develop EPDs. That's coming over the next several years. The first big batch of that got announced just recently, to the tune of I think 150, 160 million dollars. But there is lots and lots of funding that's been built into the different legislation that's come out on the use of EPDs for low carbon, the requirements for low carbon, and then also this grant assistance for actually developing EPDs. So definitely, if you're interested in tracking that more closely, we imagine track that very closely. So be happy to, in any case, link you up with the funding opportunities where they arise. And we're also seeing this drive for EPD show up in different markets, in large part due to some of the tech companies that are building, major real estate developers, think Amazon and Facebook and the warehouses, the data centers, that are all now requiring EPDs to some degree to promote their low carbon, or to further their low carbon objectives for construction. And we've seen Amazon embrace this very wholeheartedly with some of their procurement, even to the point of setting thresholds and benchmarks, which is what this is. And then there's a number of different kind of private sector companies that have made what we call embodied carbon commitments. So commitments to build low carbon, and with EPDs being the main mechanism for communicating low carbon, it's our understanding that EPDs are really the backbone of a lot of these company strategies. So globally, yeah, there's a significant movement, I'd say, towards low carbon and using EPDs for low carbon. So what does this all look like from an implementation standpoint? I think there's a few kind of key concepts to consider here, and the first one is this ideas of transparency and performance. So like I was saying, as things are kind of getting off the ground, I think the move is towards more transparency, and we're seeing, requirements that just like specifications just require to have an EPD. We've seen that for several years, but what we're seeing now too is the use of benchmarks and setting thresholds. So like that Amazon one I showed you, and for instance, the GSA, they have performance thresholds that we're currently that they've put out there, and we're currently working with Federal Highways and EPA and others on developing these thresholds, these benchmarks. So this idea that an EPD, a product-specific EPD, is really about providing the necessary transparency on your products, but with that in the background, that there are industry average LCAs and EPDs that have been used to develop essentially the standards or the thresholds that you're going to be measured against. And there are a number of different benchmarks in the ready-mix concrete space. CRMCA is probably the leader there. Our group has worked with CRMCA for many years, going back to our days prior to WAP with the Athena Institute, going back to 2012, I think, generating EPDs, and we're currently in the process of updating these industry benchmarks. So I'm not sure who's on the line, but we do have several hundred companies nationwide with good regional representation that are participating in that study. So there's, for those of you that are currently using or participating in that study, we're actually utilizing our software, our LCA EPD software, as a data collection and analysis tool for that. So if you happen to be participating in that study and providing us data, then some of our our software should look really familiar because it's the same software we use for that, for both purposes. And then again, there's these other industry groups like NAPA and asphalt, PCI, ACPA and precast, NSSGA that, for those of you that have different product offerings, perhaps you're members of those groups. And I can say that pretty much all of them have either been involved with industry-wide benchmarking over the last couple of years or are currently undertaking it. Currently working with PCI and ACPA and precast. We have a long-standing relationship with NAPA, and like I said, CRMCA is currently updating their industry-wide averages. And then these are all regional. They always have been. I think this go around, we're looking more and more at smaller regions because some of these are quite broad still. So we are looking at different state level participation and in coordination with NRMCA, where essentially the plan is to publish benchmarks and results for as granular level as we possibly can. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. If anybody had any questions, I'm going to stop sharing screen for just a second while, almost left the meeting. That would have been good. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can pull up the software and give you a bit of a rundown on that. But while I'm doing that, it's kind of the halfway point. If anybody had any questions or concerns, it's kind of a small group. Feel free to jump in. Okay, hearing none. Good. Yeah, so those of you that aren't familiar with our software, it's a simple web-based tool with, essentially we provide you login credentials and account information, and you are able to then log in through our web portal. This is what the landing page looks like. If and when you are getting set up, one of the first things we do is we have the ability to assign users. So let's say if you have somebody helping you, let it go to sleep, log back in. So those of you that are, let's say, have someone helping you at a plant level, gather data, it's really straightforward for you to create new users in the system and then to assign those to different plants. We find that super helpful for those of you that, let's say, have somebody at a plant level that is really close to the information, but then you have somebody, let's say, managing that process for multiple plants that wants to essentially limit access so that, assign users only what they need to see. So we have that set up, I think, pretty simply, so you can create users and assign them to plants. Once you've done that, well, I should have mentioned this, the first part here is you actually have plant management. So you can essentially set your of all your plants. If you need to add new plants, you can do that simply by putting it in here. And when you do that, we get a notification that there's new plants in the system, that we're working together. So it's as simple as that, to go in there once you have your credentials and to create a new plant, enter in the plant name, where it's located, what kind of product, if it's a ready-mix plant, and then to save it, and then it'll show up here in your plant list. And once you've essentially established the plant list that you're going to be working with, then you can assign the users to the plants. I think the more interesting part is the data. So I'll go through that hopefully with enough detail that you leave some understanding of what kind of data and information we're going to be looking for from you guys. So the way we have this set up, the first part is the survey. So we kind of start at the manufacturing, this kind of what's core to you and your operations. And to do that, we gather data over a continuous year basis. So think, for instance, a calendar year. If you happen to be doing things on a fiscal year, and it's easier that way, we can take that. But it needs to be essentially an annual amount of information. It needs to be consistent across all the different data that we are gathering. The key here is that we're not asking you to calculate anything. You know, likely you'll have to go to different people in your organization. When we get to it in a second, things like purchasing, whoever's handling the power bills, things like that. But we're expecting to pull information in your native units without you having to do any conversions or calculation or normalizing, anything like that. So you can see this one, this is kind of a dated one, but in the year 2020, starting in January, ending in December, you'd likely use 2023, or if you're working on a partial year for a fiscal, something like that. And then from there, we ask, this is for our statistics that we're gathering for CRMCA, is we are interested in kind of generally speaking, the breakdown of the different strength classes you're producing. So how much is below 3,000 PSI, between 3,000 and 5,000, and then the percentage that's greater than 5,000, kind of higher strength concretes. Once we have that, we're interested in the total production. This plant produces 55,000 cubic yards a year. But you know, at this point, it's really just the total volume of all the different products, all the different mixes. We're also asking for batch waste. So this is going to be basically overage, like if you're producing more than you're placing, the amount that comes back to the plant. We have that, we take that information here. And I can tell you that if this number is not tracked, the product category rules that we use require us to put in a really conservative assumption. I think it's like 5%, which is quite high for most people. So it really, if return concrete isn't currently one of those things you're tracking, then it might be something to kind of gear up for the coming years, because it is one of the key factors. Moving past that, the next piece of information we need is energy use. So think electricity use. We have these other things here. If you happen to be generating any renewable power, so if you happen to have solar panels in your plant or something like that, you can put it here. But by and large, we're looking for the primary energy sources. So think electricity, natural gas. For your natural gas, we've got all kinds of different units in there, depending on if you're buying it. Your bill comes in on a BTU or cubic feet or therms or what have you. We should have you covered here. And if not, definitely let us know. Beyond that, things like fuels, fuel oil, diesel use. We have two different places to put diesel use. Diesel use at the plant, and then diesel use in the fleet. The reason that's important is because, as I said, the EPDs are cradle to gate. So the portion of the diesel used in the truck that is used on site in the mixing operations relative to the delivery, we actually do a bit of a breakdown there. We call it an allocation, where we allocate 30% of that energy to the mixing. So that would end up in the EPD. And then that 70% we assume is delivery, which isn't included in EPD. So kind of a little distinction there. If you are using truck mixers as opposed to a central mixing facility, the diesel used in those, we actually allocate only a portion of it to the production. Moving down, we have things like if you're using any dust suppression at your plants, if you got any off-road, basically, things like that, oils, lubricants, greases. Now, as we start to get further down this list, our understanding, these are probably going to be less tracked. So if you get to a point where you don't have data for something like this, you would just leave it blank, and then we have industry averages that we can apply there. What's really critical here is primarily your energy use. That's what's going to drive your global warming potential. And then to the degree that you're interested in, and the degree that you can, I should say, we do ask for water use. But again, if this is an unmetered connection, for instance, like a well, then you would leave that blank, and we can apply some industry, set our assumptions there. But if you have a metered water connection, you put in the actual water use you're using on an annual basis. Moving down, things like hazardous waste. This is waste that has to go to some kind of special treatment. You can see here there's a really large number, and the software has actually thrown an error message at me that I'm much higher than our threshold. This is good, kind of a first level check. We have that built into the survey as you're putting in information. But if you, let's say, mess up a unit and you're, an order of magnitude too high, that we try and flag those for you as much as we can. We also manually review all of this data. So once you've completed it, we actually go all the way through the survey and compare it against our industry benchmarks and where things should be. And then the last part on here are air and water emissions. Again, only if it's tracked, it says if tracked. So if you happen to be needing to report something under Clean Air Act or something like that, which I'm going to assume that most, if not all of you, don't need to do that, then these would all just be zero for you. It's not going to be any direct air or water emissions. But if you do need to track that and report that, then that would go there. Okay. This next part is now taking a step back and looking at the suppliers that go into each of these plants. So the way we have that set up is you create what's called a supplier directory. So these are all the different vendors that you're working with that you're going to then want to use to create concrete mixes. So a little bit of setup here going through. When you do that, you put in the name, the material type. You can see that it's got a few different categories, and then the address and where things are located. Then it's going to show up in the supplier directory. Probably more important than once that's set up is we have you put in the distances between those suppliers and your plants. So what we're looking for here, and this is what actually takes a supplier and then links it to the plant so that you can actually pull on that material. If it's not showing up in these tables, then you won't be able to see it. You then go to create a product here in just a second. So we're looking for truck, rail, ocean. If you are importing anything by ocean or rail, for instance, we can help with some of those calculations. But things like truck, it's really just the road distance on Google Maps, so whatever special route you might be taking, moving materials from point A to point B to your plant. So things like aggregates, cement, slag cement, etc., all the different materials. And once this happens, once you've gone through this process and you actually hit this little lock button, you submit the survey and hit the lock button, it goes back to us. And at that point, we then submit this for third-party verification. One of the key features of EPDs is they're all third-party verified. And the way that works is the reviewers through, let's say, an ASTM or an CRMCA, for instance, EPD North America, which is a new EPD program, they come in and review all of the information you've put up to this point. So all of your suppliers, your supplier distances, and then your plant data. And once they sign off on that, you can then move forward to the last part of this, which is actually what we call managing mixes and creating EPDs. Once the verification is complete, you're able to create unlimited EPDs as you see fit without needing to go back through an additional verification for each EPD. And the reason we're able to do that is because the background information has all been checked, the calculation methodology has been checked and verified, and then as you'll see in a second, the software actually introduces some thresholds and it prevents you from producing impossible mixes. So I'll go and show, let's just go to a mix. So you can see here, I just selected from the drop-down the different mixes that are currently in the software. And you can see that this is a 2,500 PSI mix that I've added some slag cement into. And we're talking carbon reduction strategies, and actually where the rubber hits the road, this is where it hits the road. On this screen, you're very easily able to edit any of the amounts. So let's say I can optimize my cement. I'm going from a 150 down to a 140. And then this, let's say in order to do that, I'm needing to increase my slag cement by 15 pounds, something like that. I can really quickly do that in this user interface. And then all I need to do to calculate a new result is come down to the calculate button. And you can see in real time, I calculated my new carbon. In this case, it actually went up a little bit. But the idea is that you can very quickly change or modify your products here in the software. So you can change and swap out SCMs. You can change, let's say if you're needing to use additional admixtures as part of that strategy, you can quickly do that and understand the trade-offs. If you're, you can see here that these are all, when I'm selecting a new ingredient, these are all of the options I have. So let's say if I'm comparing two different cement or other kind of vendors, I want to see that in real time, I can do that. One of the other kind of important features is this little magnifying glass here. And with that magnifying glass, I can actually see a very, very detailed breakdown of all the environmental impacts. So this allows me really quickly, as we talked about mix optimization being one of the key strategies to lower carbon, this gives me a very detailed breakdown right here on this screen of the go-on potential of all the different materials that I have in my product. And as you can imagine, Portland cement being the greatest contributor here, and slag cement, some of these others being less, but also significant. It also allows me to really quickly go through and look at what we call the A2. This is the transportation of materials to your plant, and to see that, oh, let's see, I've got 4 kilograms of CO2 caused by trucking, the aggregate portion of this. And that's obviously much more significant than some of these others. It's really been driven by the aggregate. So if, let's say, one of the strategies you might be looking at might be aggregate some of these heavier materials, sourcing them closer to your plants. That's a very logical thing to do. And then you can keep scrolling down and you can actually look at the A3. So this look basically all the things you filled out in your operations survey. This gives you a really detailed breakdown of the CO2 equivalent. You can see here that, say, that hazardous solid waste that I put in that I know was an error, put it in anyway. It shows a really high number here, but that makes sense because it's a bug. It's bad data. So we can quickly kind of, one of the things we do to help analyze these is once your data's in, we actually look at these screens to really quickly see if it makes sense, if the impacts are where we think they should be, and to flag things that are out of whack. But I think everybody gets that the main place you can play is in optimizing the mix design, swapping out cements for SCMs, changing your water cement ratio so you're reducing cement that way, different kind of mix optimization strategies. And then the last thing I'll close with is on this is, so once you've gone through and you've modified your mix, you're satisfied that it's showing you the result that you're going to need. So let's say, for instance, you're considering this against a threshold or a benchmark that you're essentially below that. We've got a few options here. You can really quickly just create the EPD. So clicking that download EPD button allows me to just generate an EPD. You know, you saw that within a few seconds of my new mix design. And it has all the results on it, but also all the detailed information that's required of all the EPDs. So you got that option. We also have this little cloud button. This essentially takes this EPD and it publishes it directly into digital repositories, so they can become searchable for groups like GSA and things like that that are pulling their information from databases like EC3, for instance. And then we also have some other features around managing EPDs. This one actually doesn't have any, it's just not a real plant, but you can see all the different EPDs that are published here. And then we also even have benchmarking. So as these thresholds start to become more and more defined, I can actually, in real time, create a little benchmark report where I'm comparing against the benchmark report graphically, and then I can actually even generate this one where I'm showing my declared mix where the benchmark is. This one's actually worse than the benchmark, so this is a great example. But to show an additional deliverable so you can provide it to that procurement person shows right away that you're below their threshold. So I'm going to just pull back up this. So that's some of the features in Theta. Like I said, you know, it's really designed for EPDs to really kind of quickly move you through different steps that's required to do an EPD. But one of the key parts of that is actually modifying your mixes, managing your products, showing those trade-offs, and you can do that really quickly within the software. So, you know, we see this as a really powerful tool for not just checking a box and hitting your compliance, but also implementing different strategies and testing different scenarios maybe considered. And we do have, for those of you that want to be in touch with us, I'm sure you have my email. If not, we can get it to you. But we also have a little sign-up page for CRMCA where you come in through that way, and we know who you're coming through, and we can make sure we give you the best possible rate for our EPDs that we have especially negotiated with CRMCA. So very excited, you know, as we move through this fall and to see how things continue to kind of accelerate around EPDs, how we can possibly help and coach you through some of the data parts. May seem a little daunting, I think, probably to the uninitiated having gathered this, but one of the key takeaways there is that if you find yourself struggling with data, then it's probably a place where we can help. It's probably that it's one of those less tracked, less significant, or it's somewhere we have the information that, you know, we can help complete the information and do it here. You know, if there's a unit missing or something like that, where we try to be as responsive as we can to make as simple as we can. So with that, I'll close, and Jessica, if you had any closing remarks.
Sure, excuse me. I do have a couple of questions while we have just a few more minutes on the line that I was writing down that I feel like our members and folks on the line may have interest in.
Yep.
I have a question. So I've heard that larger companies in the private sector realm have requested audits of companies' business practices that go beyond just environmental impact from a mix or product specific design perspective. Have you witnessed this at all in your line of work from, say, the larger tech companies saying, we want to know more about how you operate as a business in your local community, beyond, again, your mix design impact?
Yeah, I definitely have, and I know that, as these guys move into different markets, they want to, be seen as good environmental stewards, and their partners be seen in the same way. Um, I can tell you that, myself and my kind of role is really around the EPDs, but WAP is a full service consulting company. We've got 70, 80 folks doing all sorts of things, ES&G, corporate sustainability, material health. Like we have whole divisions kind of centered around those kind of key areas. So definitely that is one of the ways we differentiate ourselves, is that, as you're moving down your EPD journey, there's probably other things that are happening simultaneously, and we found it really valuable to a lot of folks if they can come to kind of one stop and get a lot of that assistance. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I mentioned that just as an anticipatory kind of question for producers to be thinking
Mhm.
holistically about sustainability versus just the singularity of GWP around mixed designs, because it goes
Right.
beyond that. So I just wanted to ask if you've seen that in terms of a trend. Also, from an industry perspective, we have committed to net zero or decarbonization by 2050 per our roadmap. With the specifying community desiring more, granular and localized information, do you anticipate firms specifically preferring producers and procuring concrete that have achieved net zero as kind of like an industry leadership standpoint?
Yeah, we're definitely moving towards that, more towards performance based. Now, um, I haven't, let's say, it's early for the net zero part of it. We have seen a little bit of that where people are actually going out and purchasing carbon credits to basically offset, their production. Not a lot of that, but I think as we get further down this road and closer to those kind of commitments, that you're likely to see more of that. But we definitely are seeing a definitely shift in the last couple of years away from this just pure transparency, more towards performance and wanting to know, okay, it's not good enough just to have an EPD, but what are you doing about it? What are you doing with the information?
Okay. Yeah, I also had offsetting here as an option as we, from a performance standpoint, do the best that we can. There's only so much carbon you can offset, barring any unforeseen SCMs or admixtures or
Right.
cements that will achieve net zero. But again, just like to kind of let our members have an idea of what's on the horizon, even in the next, say, 20 years. I mean, this could happen pretty soon.
Yeah.
Um, and then lastly, as a question, and we can open it up for folks in the line, does your software have the capability, or do you know of any capabilities for owners that would, again, look at their plants in particular and identify leverage areas from an energy use standpoint or a mixed design perspective standpoint that will, again, provide them with the business case? Say, like, they want to install solar to offset some of their
Mhm.
operational emissions. Is that
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I think is underutilized right now, we call it having an R&D setup. So what we can do is when we set up a plant, we actually copy that in its entirety, and we have one that's the production that's being used to generate the EPDs, and that all has to be locked down for our verification. But we actually also have the option to leave all of that unlocked, basically to take all of the train wheels and thresholds, and in that case, you can't produce a real EPD, but you can change absolutely anything in the system. So you could test out what would happen if I reduced my electricity, or substituted, let's say, natural gas fleet or renewable gas, energy fleet, those kind of real world decisions you're looking at. So yeah, definitely, we have the ability to do that, and I think it's really powerful for that.
awesome? Yeah, I'm particularly interested in looking at, say, designing a new plant or a new ready mix facility that takes into consideration all of those components, or even a retrofit to an existing plant, because
Right.
that is always a real business decision for folks that are operating in this realm. But
Yep.
do want to let folks on the line. Those were my questions that I had for you in terms of the journey to decarbonization, looking beyond just, again, the LCA EPD perspective. If anyone on the line has further questions, we can open that up. Otherwise, truly appreciate your time.
Mhm.
would just like to say an excellent presentation and great follow-up questions too. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. We'll let people get to lunch.
Yep, it's time. Thank you. Thank you all for joining today, and thank you again, James. We appreciate you, and we will be following up with resources for our members across the 3 communities of ready mix producers. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Bye.